For those of you who may have gotten an advance copy and started to read this ahead of your time, you know that one of the main characters in this book, besides Jesuit Father John Markoe, is a Creighton student named Denny Holland. He believed in justice and desegregation, and with Father Markoe, he began the DePorres Club in Omaha. Even though he was the unpaid leader of the DePorres Club through his years as a student at Creighton and beyond, he was willing to live on very little because he was committed full-time to this cause and to the work of the DePorres Club. I think the most important thing I can say about our speaker today is that he is Denny Holland's son. Matt Holland is an administrator in the Omaha public school system, and he too has a sense of purpose about his life. Since 2002, he has been researching, presenting, and writing about the Omaha DePorres Club. Matt not only had a lifetime of conversation with his father, but he interviewed others who are still alive, who were young people in the 1940s and 50s, and were part of this. And he had his dad's archives. He has written a story about that DePorres Club that gives us insights into the motives, the struggles, the growth, and the victories experienced by this club as it fought to bring about a change in the city that was known by African Americans and many parts as the Birmingham of the North for its discriminatory policies. And that was years before anyone really thought to challenge or wonder why this was popular or acceptable. It simply was not. And this group of young, committed people, along with Father Markoe, decided they were going to challenge this. We're grateful that he wrote this book. It offers us a little-known piece of the history of our own city and helps us understand the challenges of Omaha 60 years ago and today. Please help me welcome Matt Holland.
Thank you. That was very nice. First of all, thank you to Maureen and Father Alexander for the invitation to be here today. It is my distinct pleasure to be on the Creighton campus to share the story of the Omaha DePorres Club with you today. As Maureen said, my connection to the Omaha DePorres Club began with my father, Denny Holland, and the archive of materials that he kept from his years as the DePorres Club president that included all of the meeting minutes from 1947 to 1954, all the photographs, all of the flyers, and you'll see a lot of those in this presentation today. This is a presentation that I've been giving at area high schools, middle schools, to social studies teachers for the last 5 to 6 years. And one of the most wonderful things that happens after this presentation is some young man or some young woman will come up to me and look at me and say, "How come I've never heard of this before?" And that's a great question, and it opens a lot of things. And I hope maybe when we're done here, some of you have some of those same types of questions. And I'm going to go ahead and start into this because I know there'll be some time at the end for questions, and I've kind of narrowed it down and made it a little Creighton-centric today as well. So I will start with this slide. And this, when I do this with high school students, I have it, because there's the standardized testings in the Omaha Public Schools. I have A, B, C, D, and they have a multiple choice, and they have to pick the city in which this photograph was taken. And I'll give them Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, and Omaha. Now, some kid may guess Omaha, but almost never will they guess that this picture was taken on the corner of 24th and Wirt in Omaha, Nebraska in the summer of 1953. And that is where I begin, and that's where kids look at me. And as we go through this, you'll see some photographs. Another response I get from young people is, as I show photographs of what Omaha looks like today compared to what it did in the older pictures, my grandmother lives there. That's my uncle's barber shop. And they leave the room with a different vision of North 24th Street, a different vision of civil rights, that it wasn't something that happened in a galaxy far, far away, that it happened here in Omaha. So we're going to start with this gentleman right here. And he is the crux of the Omaha DePorres Club, and he ate 2 chapters in my book, and I had a hard time keeping him to 2 chapters. His name was John Markoe. He was a graduate of West Point in 1914. This is a picture of him graduating the U.S. Cavalry. He graduated a year ahead of and played football with Dwight Eisenhower at West Point. Unfortunately, as one classmate described him, he had a flaw that followed him throughout his life, and he was kicked out of the Army in 1917, dishonorably discharged for behavior unbecoming an officer. To his advantage, he had a younger brother named William, who was a Jesuit at St. Stanislaus Seminary outside of St. Louis, and William convinced John that joining the Jesuits would be the next best move after getting kicked out of the Army. You can see why he ate 2 chapters of my book, because he's just getting started. In 1917, John, William, and 2 other Jesuits novitiates at the seminary signed a pledge for the work and salvation of the Negroes in the United States, and they pledged to daily repeat this resolution for the fulfillment of our expectations and desires. So you've got a man who was kicked out of the military, he's an alcoholic, and he's signed a pledge to basically challenge the system. He got moved a lot by the Jesuits, would be the best way to put it. Because he would get to a city, and he would start a group challenging whether it was Denver, whether it was Milwaukee, whether it was St. Louis, and he was in all of those places multiple times. And then he would occasionally go on benders, and they'd have to haul him out of. So he got moved around a lot. But this is what his life consisted of, was challenging in the church, in civic organizations as well, challenging discrimination and racial segregation in the United States. In 1946, he was moved to Creighton University. That's a really nice synopsis for saying he got kicked out of St. Louis for his role in the integration of St. Louis University. And the Jesuits figured maybe they'd move into Omaha and he couldn't cause any trouble in Omaha. In 1947, he went to Milwaukee and gave a speech, The Morality of the Color Line, and in that speech he ended with this quote, "Our final appraisal of this pernicious social custom is, to use mathematical language," he was a mathematics professor, "is that the color line is immoral to the 3rd degree." In 1947, to say that racism or segregation was immoral was not widely held anywhere, including in the Catholic Church. And that was a statement that was not agreed to or accepted by a large number of people. In 1947, and this is where the story just brilliantly meshes together, this young man, Denny Holland, who had just left the Navy and enrolled at Creighton, he approached Father John Markoe. Denny Holland had had an experience at the Friendship House in Chicago, working in inner city Chicago, that had heightened his awareness of the racial situation in the United States. And one of Denny Holland's professors said, well, you should talk to John Markoe, he's interested in that as well. And they decided to start a group to discuss racial issues, and they began meeting on the Creighton campus in November of 1947. This is a picture of the Omaha DePorres Club, in the winter of 1948, just a few months after they started meeting. This woman right here is Bertha Calloway, who started the Great Plains Black History Museum. This is a gentleman, Raymond Matoyer, whose family is a prominent family in North Omaha. This is a woman named Virginia Walsh, who's still surviving. Her mother here, that's an imposing woman, if you can get a good look at her. Her name was Mary Frederick. And you can see there's a mix of African American and white. There's some middle-aged housewives and some young white Creighton students. Denny Holland, who was the president, he recalled he thought he was joining a prayer group. Father Markoe quickly changed that notion. But this was what Denny Holland had to say about the reaction they got when they tried to convince businesses, parish priests, that what they were doing was morally wrong. And at that time, that was not an accepted notion. But it was the one thing that Father Markoe used to keep these young people grounded and, in a sense, make them feel safe. Because as they challenged and were pushed back, he kept telling them, this is wrong, it's a moral issue, no different than any other sin, we have to challenge it. And that was the one thing that kept them coming back, because they knew they were doing something that was based on a very simple factor. Father Markoe, to help the DePorres Club, not only for them, the club members to understand what they were doing, but to let the public know what they were doing, created a credo and a pledge. And there's a lot of one human race, live a full and complete life, but really it comes down to just a few boxes in here. We condemn as unjust every form of compulsory segregation, any and all forms of discrimination against individuals because of color, and we pledge to strive in every way possible to get others to do the same. That's really what it boiled down to. The speech that I mentioned, Father Markoe gave in Milwaukee in 1947, he took that speech and condensed it and had it published as a pamphlet. In 1951, the Bishop of Grand Rapids gave it imprimatur, but it was printed in 1949. It was 2 years before it received imprimatur from the Catholic Church. And basically, the pamphlet, A Moral Appraisal of an Individual Act of Racial Discrimination, was based on a premise, and Father Markoe, again, was a mathematics and philosophy professor. He created a situation and then followed it through as a logical syllogism, and the situation was that a white business owner denies service to a black customer, and the question is it moral or immoral? And then he goes through using mathematical and philosophical language to prove that it is indeed an immoral act. Now, to give you an idea of what it was like in Omaha, Nebraska in 1947, 48, 49, because really if you think of Omaha, Nebraska, even today you think cows and corn, and are there African Americans in Omaha? That would have been a question even then, and it may be today for some people. This was a postcard that was mailed out by the Kuntz Place neighborhood, which is a neighborhood that surrounds the present area of Sacred Heart Church and a little bit north of there. And this was mailed out by the Neighborhood Association, which at the time was entirely white. The church parish was entirely white. And this was a postcard. This was the front of it. You can see November 3rd, 1950. Okay, this is the back of the card. And for the people in the back, I blew it up for you a little bit. This is one of the entries that was on this. It was mailed from a neighborhood association in Omaha, Nebraska in 1950. They threw this in here just in case you forgot. And there was a woman named Elizabeth Pittman who was running for the school board that year. And this says one Negro member on the school board can bring Negro teachers to our schools, so only vote for the white candidates, because that would not be acceptable. But this is the real reason this card was mailed out to the homeowners in this association. If you're going to sell your home, we will find a white buyer for you. Do not sell your home to a person of color, because what happened, and that's how neighborhoods changed in Omaha, there was a process called redlining. There was an agreement through bankers, insurance companies, realtors, that when the pressure of the near north side, which was a contained neighborhood, became so great, there was an agreement that that line would move, and that line would move perhaps into this neighborhood. A white homeowner would sell to a black person, and that street would flip within a matter of months from white to black. Home values would go down, people would move out of the neighborhood. This neighborhood was trying to resist that process. So that gives you an idea of what was going on in Omaha. Because if the Omaha DePorres Club, you have to think, if the Omaha DePorres Club existed to fight racism, the correlation must be there must have been some racism to fight. And this gives you an example of what they were up against. In 1964, Father Markoe wrote an editorial in the Omaha Star, and he described his experience with Jim Crow in Omaha, Nebraska in this language. He was not one to beat around the bush. Creighton University in the fall of 1948 was getting phone calls from parents wondering why I'll say this as clearly as I can, why their white daughter was a member of a club that had young black men in it. That was one of the reasons there was some pressure. Another reason they were getting phone calls was because parishes in North Omaha, one of which was Sacred Heart, was calling Creighton University saying, who are these people that came to our church and told us we had to admit blacks in our school because they live in our parish boundaries? And Creighton University president at the time, Father McCabe, called John Markoe and Denny Holland in and said, I think you guys need to find another place to meet. Now, Father Markoe, wisely, when he started the club, the DePorres Club was not affiliated with Creighton. It wasn't affiliated with the Catholic Church. It had no points of pressure that could cause it to be influenced. So what they did, they would agree to move off the campus, and they rented a vacant storefront on the corner of 24th and Grace. And this is a picture before it changed over. It was Maria's Espanol Tamales and Chili Shop. And they made that their home for the next 2 years and called it the Omaha DePorres Center. They brought in speakers. They did a lot of what my dad called the sweet, gentle things, and they could get a lot of people to do these. They painted houses. They had speakers. They gave away clothes. They had children's youth groups. And they did that for about 2 years. They visited a few businesses, but they really weren't interested in that confrontational process just yet. And this is where what it looks like today. This is Grace Street, tees off into 24th, and the Omaha DePorres Center was right here in that alleyway was where those children were playing. That's what it looks like today. Eventually, Father Markoe got to the point where he felt there needed to be some action. He told Denny Holland that if there was not some action taking place, he, Father Markoe, was going to leave the club. Well, at that point, Denny Holland realized that if Father Markoe left, the club was no longer going to be viable. So several things happened in the summer of 1950 that made it possible for the DePorres Club to start to do some more confrontational, and they didn't have to look far. They looked for businesses that refused to hire African Americans. And one of them was housed in this building right here with the Ed Holmes Sherman Laundry. 70 to 80% of their customers are African American, and they refused to hire blacks except to do the laundry. They wouldn't hire them to be clerks or drive delivery vans. So the DePorres Club met with the owners and said, hey, we would like you to do this. And the owner said, why should we? It's never been a problem before, assuming that these 4 college kids were going to leave and never come back, which created a problem for a lot of businesses in Omaha because that's never what happened. They didn't leave and not come back. If you've ever seen the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when at the end they're being chased and they keep looking back and these guys keep following them and they keep asking, who are these guys? That's what businesses said about the Omaha DePorres Club. Who are these guys? They won't go away. They won't shut up, and they keep coming back. That had to be the reaction to these businesses because this business had been viable in North Omaha for generations. There'd never been a problem before, and suddenly these people came in and said they had to change. Their response obviously was to ignore them. And so the first boycott of the Omaha DePorres Club took place, but they really weren't quite sure what they were doing because it's not like you could shoot an email out and say, hey, how'd that boycott go last week for you guys? So they were making this up, and so they wrote a letter, and they very gently, it's a long letter. We really don't want to do this. But if you don't change, here's what we think we're going to have to do. We're going to inform people of your decision and ask them to withdraw their business until such a time as the policy of hiring in your establishment is changed. They were threatening a boycott, which was a scary thing in Omaha at the time. Okay? These are some actual scans from DePorres Club meeting minutes. In October of 1950, the surviving owner of the Ed Holmes Sherman Laundry passed away, so the Ed Holmes Sherman Laundry was sold to the Emerson Saratoga Laundry, which was across the street. They immediately moved the boycott to the Emerson Saratoga Laundry that followed the same policies of serving high number of African American customers and not employing them. And by February, Emerson Saratoga had hired a young lady to work in their office, but this is my favorite part. Some smart businessman opened a business on North 24th Street that hired only African American employees, had an African American manager and assistant manager in response to, oh, well, if you won't hire black, we'll have a business that's entirely staffed by African Americans. And then another laundry down here, it's Mr. Thurman of Evans Laundry, hired another clerk. So it had a ripple effect because the other laundries were watching the impact on the Emerson Saratoga Laundry. So some people have asked me, how many jobs? Well, right here you're looking at maybe 8 or 10 jobs created that were not available to blacks in North Omaha prior to this action. After 2 years at the DePorres Center on North 24th Street, they couldn't keep up with the $40 a month rent. Their meeting minutes are always, don't have any money, going to have a bake sale, going to have a fundraiser, don't have any money. It's just nonstop. So Mildred Brown, who was the publisher and owner of the Omaha Star, offered them the opportunity to meet at the Omaha Star at no cost. and it was their home for the remainder of their existence, basically until 1954. This is a photograph taken probably around 1950, 51. Denny Holland, Max Brownell, who was a DePorres Club member, Mildred Brown, Father Markoe. This is where it gets interesting for me. Gene Waite, who was the secretary of club, who then married this guy. And that's my mom. So my mom and dad, the story of the DePorres Club is the story of my family as well. And then a woman named Eve Hanna in front of the Omaha Star. And I always wondered, what kind of car is that back there? That's a cool looking car. Okay. So they moved to the Omaha Star. The Omaha Star looks like today. And this is where I love that young people like, oh, that's what that place is. Okay. The following year, and there were lots of things going on. I'm just trying to do a flyover, hit the high spots for you. The following year, the DePorres Club approached the Omaha Coca-Cola bottling company about their refusal to hire African Americans. There had been a short-lived boycott in the black community against Coca-Cola. It had gone away when Coca-Cola said, oh yeah, we'll hire some guys next spring. Well, the boycott went away the next spring. Nobody was hired. So the DePorres Club approached the company and went through the same process. This is what it looks like today. This is the Midwest Box Company on 30th. Howard Kennedy Elementary is right up the hill from here. And again, they wrote a letter, and they said, we're going to stop supporting discrimination with people's money. And again, Coca-Cola's response was like, yeah, whatever, go away. But the gentleman who was the plant manager, Jeffrey Smith, wrote his thesis here at Creighton in 1965 and interviewed the manager of Mac Gothard was his name, and he had a wonderful quote. He said, all I know about the DePorres Club is that if they'd have come into my office today, 15 years later, the hair on the back of my neck would not have stood up like it did then. So that was the reaction of these people coming in, and who are you to tell me who we can hire, even though I know it's wrong. So they were gently pushing people and getting a lot of pushback. This was one of the original flyers that was in the box of stuff that my dad kept. You can see where it's taped up in a barbershop or a storefront, most likely on North 24th Street. And I love this. This is a petition that the DePorres Club circulated up and down North 24th Street to convince businesses to not carry Coca-Cola, although they had to change it. It said it will not handle Coke. It had to be changed to will not restock because a business owner said, well, I got to sell what I have. Then I won't buy anymore. So they changed it. So all of these businesses signed this petition. All these businesses signed. All these businesses signed. 47 businesses said they wouldn't carry Coke anymore. And Coke, this had nothing to do with what might happen later. This had no impact that Coca-Cola would tell you. Okay? But 47 businesses on North 24th Street would no longer carry Coke. Many of these were bars, barbershops that sold a lot of Coca-Cola. Now this is where I tried to make it a little Creighton-centric. Father Markoe was still on the Creighton campus. He was still teaching classes as he continued to help the DePorres Club move along. And Father Carl Reinert, who was the current president of Creighton University, was trying to figure out what was going on with the DePorres Club and Father Markoe and the Coca-Cola company. And he wrote Father Markoe a letter and said, hey, it looks like you guys have been successful. It looks like Coca-Cola is going to change their policy. And Father Markoe wrote back and said, well, actually, they're saying that they're going to hire a couple of guys. But in the meantime, why don't you write them, the Coca-Cola company, and say, hey, I was wondering if we should keep selling Coke at Creighton because, you know, that your policies might not be something we would agree to. So Father Markoe was continuing to push because he knew that Coca-Cola, their stated actions were probably not going to be followed through. So Father Reinert wrote to Mr. Gothard at Coca-Cola, and I love this. I certainly don't want this letter to seem like a threat. But the first paragraph is him saying, hey, your policy of not hiring people just because of the color of their skin is something we don't really think is good. And we've enjoyed your service up till now, but it would be terrible if we had to discontinue. And please help me understand. So Matt Gothard, who was a Creighton graduate, wrote back to Father Markoe, and there's two very wonderful quotes in here. One, he describes the DePorres Club as beginning a series of impulsive, threatening, and peculiar actions, which means he doesn't know what the heck they're doing. And the other is that, and this was something that the DePorres Club continued to fight, that it seems like they smell of an ideology that presently we're fighting with blood and sacrifice to stamp out. The DePorres Club was tainted with communism because communists fought for racial equality more than anybody in the United States. So if you were doing that, you were probably a communist. So he thought that they were possibly communists as well. The DePorres Club, Coca-Cola responded by hiring these gentlemen right here. But you'll notice this headline says they win the first round of the issue because the DePorres Club said, that's great, you hired those two guys. But you remember, we asked for a public statement that you were going to change your hiring policy. A week later, Coca-Cola issued a public statement that they were changing their hiring policy. And, as in the laundry boycott, there was a ripple effect. 7-Up knew what was going on, and they hired 4 more African Americans to work at their business as well. The last boycott we're going to look at was with an ice cream company that, again, when they were approached for not hiring blacks, said, that's fine, we'll go out of business before we hire blacks. I mean, okay, wow, really? Okay, and again, a letter saying, we're going to start a boycott if you don't change your policy. Okay. Handed out these flyers. This is where the Reed's Ice Cream was located, 24th and Wirt. Goodwin Barbershop is right here. Okay. And after a year, Reed's hired a saleswoman, and those of you in the back can't see that, but the DePorres Club, to show there were no hard feelings, they went to Reed's after the meeting and enjoyed some ice cream. It was business, not personal. Okay? Now, I did this here to remind me that we're going back to 1948 right now, because while they were doing all of these boycotts and doing all of these things, in 1948, they went to the Omaha Council Bus and Street Railway Company, which was Metro Area Transit at the time. They had been given a charter by the city to provide bus and streetcar services, and said, hey, you know what, we've heard through the black community that you won't hire black drivers. And they said, well, no, we won't. And we have a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was we don't feel that white female passengers would be safe. One is we just don't think society is ready for it, and they refused. So in 1948, the DePorres Club started a series of campaigns, processes that went on for 6 years before there was any change. These are some signs that they used to boycott and picket in front of. Negroes can drive buses and streetcars in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and LA. Why not Omaha? Negro GIs drive tanks, jeeps, and trucks in Korea. Why not streetcars and buses in Omaha? They had public meetings. This one is at Zion Baptist Church. And this is in 1951. This is one of the larger articles I could find in the Omaha World Herald. It wasn't that big. It was that big. That's kind of part of the answer when kids said, how come I've never heard of this? If you were black and you read the Omaha Star, you knew about the Omaha DePorres Club. If you weren't and didn't, it didn't exist for all intents and purposes. This is one of my favorites. One of the ways that the DePorres Club decided they could, as my dad remembered saying, it was as radical as we could feel we could get. The fare at the time was 18 cents. So they said, well, if you're going to get on the bus, pay with 18 pennies. Well, the first time I did this at a high school, a kid said, what's the big deal? I said, oh, nobody rides a bus, and if they do, they swipe their card. So I found this. This is what a fare box looked like in around 1950. You got on the bus, you dropped your coins through here, it landed in this box, the driver made sure it was the right fare, he cranked this down into the lockbox. So do the math. If you drop a dime, a nickel, and 3 pennies, he cranks it 5 times. You drop 18 pennies, he cranks it 18 times. You got 9 people in line and he's doing this. It starts jamming up, the lockbox fills up, he's got to stop his route, go back and empty it, get another lockbox. It really, 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 really frustrated the drivers, had no impact on the company. In the fall of 1954, the Omaha Council of Street and Railway Company hired 4 black drivers because the city told them to change their charter, because the NAACP, the Omaha Urban League, the AFL-CIO, and the DePorres Club had started a push to get the charter denied to the company, and the city said, if you want to keep your charter, you're going to have to change, and that's when they changed. In October of 1954, which correlates about the time my dad was leaving the Omaha DePorres Club, the DePorres Club voted that they disband for a while. That while ended up being 5 years. The few active members feel they deserve a rest after 8 years of at least 52 meetings a year. They were having a hard time keeping membership up. In 1959, Wilbur Phillips, who had been an early member of the DePorres Club, had just come back from Drake Law School. He had just gotten his law degree. And he decided to resurrect the DePorres Club to challenge the Omaha Public Schools to hire African American teachers and For a year, they picketed in front of schools, had newspaper articles published in the Star and the World Herald with absolutely no impact on the Omaha public schools. But what happened was materials like this and other materials that the DePorres Club had that my dad had saved were used in the lawsuit that was filed in the 1970s against the Omaha Public Schools for discrimination, and were used by the Justice Department to enforce a desegregation plan in Omaha. And this is how I'm going to wrap it up. Remember, the DePorres Club started with that argument of it was a moral issue, and we're told no, it was not. In September of 1965, an Omaha World Herald headline read, "Mayor will invite businesses to join crusade in Omaha, push for equality to right thing." He says, all must help Negroes. The push for equality is being made, the mayor said, because morally it is the right thing to do. It only took 20 years for the city of Omaha to come to that point. And with that, I'll wrap up.
Thank you so much. Please, if anybody has any questions, any comments, we've got about 15 minutes to interact with you now.
Now, was it mostly students?
It was a mix. There were Creighton students, there were students from Duchenne, which was a college, an all-girls college at the time, but then also Father Markoe made a point to go gather African Americans from mainly St. Benedict's Catholic Church to make sure that it wasn't a bunch of white kids sitting around talking about racism. And that was, so it was that mix. Tessie Edwards, who was a Creighton graduate, who was also a member of the DePorres Club, talked about it being a very diverse group of people. Some she really liked, some were most odd, she said. So it was a very eclectic group. People came and went. Kids always ask me, how many people? Well, it depended. Some weeks there were 7, some weeks there were 40. If there was something really confrontational going on, membership dropped. If they were painting houses, membership went up. So it really varied from a core to maybe up to 30 or 40, back down to a core over those years. But so it was a mix, but there was Creighton students and Duchenne students and then African Americans from North. Yes, sir.
So very informative, thank you. Was the push off the Creighton campus, as you see it, prudent, safe, cowardly, mix?
It was 1947 in Omaha, Nebraska, and it was a almost all-white Catholic university. I think it was about the only option that was available to Father McCabe at the time. And Father Markoe, there was, in fact, in the DePorres Club meeting minutes later, after they're at the DePorres Center, they talk about writing a note to Father McCabe thanking him for letting them meet on the campus. So it wasn't, there was no ill feelings. I think it was understood that, hey, I think it'd be in everybody's best interest if maybe you found someplace else to meet. It was untenable for Creighton to try to defend them, especially because it was a group that wasn't affiliated with Creighton. So, but Creighton continued, as you can see in those letters between Father Markoe and Father Reinert. And as far as the Catholic Archdiocese was concerned, my dad said the best thing the Archdiocese did was they didn't move Father Markoe. They could have easily, in reaction to him creating, he could have gone back to St. Louis, Milwaukee, Fairbanks, Alaska. I mean, they could have sent him anywhere, but they let him stay for those next 20 years, which was probably about as much support as they could provide. So yeah, so I don't see. I always say, people say, oh, they got kicked off. They were asked to find another place to meet, and I'm not parsing words there. That's exactly what happened. They did not get kicked off of the campus. Yes, ma'am.
When did the Archdiocese show leadership in this area?
Eventually. In the mid-1960s, Father Markoe and my dad worked to try to get the Archdiocese to create a committee to try to help maybe work with some of these situations. And initially, the Archdiocese response was, anybody could be a member except, and I'm not making this up, anybody could be a member except for a former DePorres Club member. That was the taint they brought with them. And it was changed shortly after. But so, and my dad continued to be on the interracial justice organizations and committees in the Archdiocese and continued to push that. But so that was 1965. And the Archdiocese was still a little bit touchy as to what was the right way to deal with this. And one of the things that came up against was when Father Markoe was one of the pushers to try to get St. Benedict's to be its own parish, as opposed to a mission parish that didn't have boundaries, which meant that if you were black and you lived in Sacred Heart, you went to St. Benedict's. Father Markoe helped push that. He wrote the editorial in the Omaha Star that really kind of blew up, basically saying that the Archdiocese was racist by creating this all-black parish right in the middle of other parish boundaries, and it needed its own parish boundaries. So, and that was late 1950s, early 1960s. So there was still there was tension. So eventually is probably the best answer I could give you. Yes, ma'am.
So your father was a remarkable man, obviously.
He was a troublemaker, as I like to refer to him. In the best way possible.
As I said, a remarkable man. So give us some insight into his upbringing and what led to him having a passion for this.
There's a very short chapter in the book, but he grew up in rural Kansas, a little town in north central Kansas. His dad, my grandfather, was a troublemaker as well. But he went into, my dad graduated from high school, went into the Navy, was training to be a pilot, left the Navy. And he talked about some experiences he'd had with black pilots and trainees in the Navy. But probably the seminal moment was when he went to the Friendship House in Chicago. And there's a passage in the book that describes a transformative moment that he had to realize that this is not right. This would be the best way. And he brought that back to Creighton that next fall and was trying to find an outlet for it, and there wasn't one, and that's when he approached Father Markoe. And there's an interesting, his first approach was to Father Markoe and say, "Are you interested in sociology?" And Father Markoe's response was, "Hell no." And then thinking quickly on his feet, my dad went, "I mean, race relay." And then Father said, "Oh, now that, yeah, I'll sit." And they sat down and started talking. So Father Markoe wasn't interested in big picture stuff. That was his, in 1917, he signed that pledge, and he was focused on that for the remainder of his life.
Your grandparents were accepting of all this, or was there any family strife that was created because of all that?
I'm sure when my mom, as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, who grew up in South Omaha, joined the club and started dating this guy, I'm sure my grandparents weren't real thrilled about it, because it was like, he didn't have a job, he had no prospects, and what he did was crazy, and not only that, he brought their daughter into it. But so it wasn't really mentioned. But I'm sure there were people that, I'm sure he lost friends and connections because of what he did, and as did lots of the DePorres Club members, but for what they did and the actions they took.
Did the other three Jesuits who signed the pledge go on and do similar things?
His brother William certainly did. There's another book to be written about William Markoe. He was a contemporary of Lafarge and a lot of the movement, the Black Catholic movement in the United States, and he was just as radical and as out there as his brother was. So, yeah, and the other two, I've done some research. One of them drowned fairly early as a young man, and the other one, I don't know what happened to him. So, but William and John continued to work and it was interesting because their first encounters with African Americans tended to be towards conversion, which, they're seminarians, they're going to go into the poor black community and start, but they realized they were converting these people to a Jim Crow church for all intents and purposes, and well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So they started to try to change the church, is what they decided they needed to do. Yes, ma'am.
Were there seminal events in Father Markoe's life that influenced his passion compared to other priests?
Yeah, he had some encounters with black troops in Texas when he was a captain, or lieutenant, excuse me, working with he was at Fort Huachuca, which had an all-black, the F troop was an all-black regiment. So he had worked closely with them. There was a story that I had read, I didn't use it in the book, about an encounter he had at West Point with the treatment of another plebe who was black. But really, by the time, what started when he got to the seminary, William had a lot of experience with the poor black communities surrounding St. Louis, and he brought John with him on those visits. And I think when John saw that, William said, we need to do something about this, because William had already been moving in that direction, and John, having been kicked out of the army and having really no focus really in his life, realized that was probably something he could do to try to redeem himself, and jumped on that. Yes?
I have a comment more so than a question.
Yes.
As an Omaha native, I'm going to sound like one of your students, but one, I really appreciated seeing and hearing this, you know, how you said students would identify. So
Good.
for me, it was the Coca-Cola plant that I had distant family members who worked at, but didn't know any about this history. And then again, in terms of more current, I went from a private school to OPS in 1976, which followed this to the original Omaha Tech High School that had hired Odra Bradley back into Omaha to really lead a citywide effort to desegregate, and it was the only open enrollment school at the time. So again, I sound like a much older student of yours, but I want to appreciate, again, it really provides a rich context, especially for someone who's grown up here in Omaha, to see and hear all of this rich tradition that really led to the privileges we've been able to experience
That's
as a
wonderful to
result.
hear. Thank you. Yes.
Where does the name come from?
They picked the name, that's a great question, I always assume and move on. St. Martin DePorres, he was at the time, he was Blessed Martin DePorres. He was a Dominican monk, I believe, in Peru in the late 1500s, worked with the poor, had another mission of working with the slaves that were brought from Africa to Peru. He is currently known as the patron saint for interracial justice and people of mixed race. His mother was black and his father was a Spaniard. And so at the time he had not been canonized. He was canonized, I think, in 1962. Yes, sir.
Did the Markoes grow up in Omaha?
No, they're from Minneapolis. Their family's originally from Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Yes.
Was there any backlash from the Omaha community, or did they just kind of think that this group would go away?
Well, part of the North Omaha, the African Americans in North Omaha didn't know what to make of them because, and somebody asked me, well, how, did they work with the NAACP and the Urban League? Yeah, as much as they could, but the NAACP and the Urban League kind of had their own set practices and procedures and protocols and connections and relationships. But Whitney Young, who was the head of the Omaha Urban League in the 40s and 50s, Dad tells the story that Whitney Young would go in and meet, in his suit with business owners and try to negotiate. One of them was with taxi companies. And one of the points he would use as a lever was like, if we can't reach an agreement, that DePorres club might get involved and I can't control them. So, so that was a good, but as far as the community, the greater community of Omaha, they didn't know the DePorres club existed. If you were white in Omaha, and I didn't live in North Omaha in Omaha, I guess would be a better way to put that. They didn't exist. It was not on the radio. Television didn't exist, and the World Herald didn't write stories. The DePorres Club met at least twice. Dad and other members met with the leadership of the Omaha World Herald at least twice, trying to understand what it was that was keeping them from writing stories. And basically, the World Herald said, "We don't think it's news." And so it just didn't exist. So the pushback they got was from the businesses in North Omaha that were owned by whites to not change their policies. But as far as the greater community didn't even know what was happening, so they couldn't react to it because it didn't exist. Yes?
Matt, just a quick comment and question related to it. To Mary Ann's point, I'm not originally from Omaha, but when I speak with people who have been in Omaha, long-time Omahans, and one example of just how different the experience of Omaha was, and perhaps still is, but for African Americans and whites, relates to Peony Park. And my older white Omahans have almost always wonderful memories of Peony Park. And when I've spoken with older African Americans, it's very painful because it was segregated and they were not allowed in. As any comments on that from the folks that you've known over the years? Is that sense accurate?
There's two sides. If you were African American in North Omaha, it was a wonderful, strong, tight-knit, supportive, highly diverse cultural community. At the other side of it was incredibly racist and segregated, contained, enforced racial community. So memory tends to go to Preston Love and I love Preston Love, but he would talk about, what a wonderful, it was such a phenomenal wonder, and it was. But at the same time, it only existed because they couldn't move outside of that community. And to go back to your point, it came to me one day in a presentation at a high school that the word ignore and ignorance have the same Latin root, which is unknown. And intentionally or otherwise, this story has been ignored, which has created ignorance. And understanding pieces of Omaha's history here, I think, at least with high school students, I see it can change your understanding of what has happened to create the situation we're in today. Because I have read posts and letters and heard things on talk radio, which I try not to listen to, but every now and again I do. And you'll hear things like, and I'm going to say, why do those people, why is it like that? Why is that situation? Well, that's why. But if you don't know that happened, then you're justified in saying why. But if you say, well, it's because they've been forced to live there for generations and denied employment, well, then maybe it starts to explain in some small way and help people understand why we are where we are today. So, and to have high school students, that's where I love going, is watching those kids, just that reality just shift enough to be like, my neighborhood did that? Those people, so that to me as an educator is a powerful experience to do that. I love doing that.
One more, Roger.
Just kind of bring it back to Creighton.
Yes.
64, something like that, Father Markoe retired and they had a reception or banquet for him.
Yeah, they had several of them. He suddenly became, one writer said that at these receptions, the irony flowed like wine. He suddenly became a great man. So anyway, I'm sorry, Roger, to cut in. Yes.
Who
Yes.
said some,
Yeah.
author Black like me, who said some very laudatory things about Father Markoe.
Yes. And I never could figure out where that connection came from, but they became very, very close in the early and mid 60s, those two did.
And I believe it
Series
was
of letters.
also at the same banquet where the Archbishop Bergen said,
Yes.
your Archbishop was wrong, and Father Markoe was right.
He was 25 years ahead of us, is what he said.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful portrait of Markoe by John Howard Griffin, who's a very fine photographer.
Yeah, he took a series of pictures of him, yeah.
I will say it's too bad that Matt's an administrator, because I think you were a whale of a teacher. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've heard the phrase many times that the movie was great, but the book is better. This was fantastic, but the book is better.